Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today I'm going to do some Christmas card making with limited edition ink pads from Lisa Horton Crafts. I just got these in. I'm so excited to start playing with them. But first I want to open them all and swatch them. When I'm swatching the Cloud9 interference pads, I have a piece of cardstock that I've used a black ink pad on half of it. And what I like to do is swatch the pad at once so that you can immediately see the look of it on the white cardstock or the black cardstock. So this one here is Crimson Cheer, and on the white cardstock it's going to show up red. On the black it's going to have a green interference. Next we have Festive Fur. Both the colors are green on that, but there's a lighter green interference on the black and kind of a more bright Kelly green on the white. The last one there is Yuletide Sky, and on the white you see blue, and on the black you see a purple interference. These are really fun to play with. I've done many videos with the interference pads, but this is my first time using the limited edition set. The next set that I'm using is the metallic pigment pads. These have such a beautiful look to them. The ink pads are really, really juicy, and I'll show you how they look on both black cardstock as well as white. They show up beautifully. So the first one here is called Copper Pot. The second one is Solid Gold. And then the third one is Silver Shine. So you can see they show up really well on both the white as well as the black. You can stamp with them, you can ink blend with them, and I'm going to do both in the video today. The third set that I'm opening is the Cloud9 Matte Blending Ink. The blue there is called Arctic Frost. The green is Merry Mistletoe, and the red is Jingleberry. So I'm going to be using those in this video as well. So the Cloud9 Matte Blending inks, they're somewhat similar to oxide inks. They are dye-based, but they have some pigment properties to them. But you can tell there's not a whole lot of pigment. You don't see a lot on that black cardstock. There's a lot more dye properties than there are pigment. So I'm going to be using those on light cardstock or white cardstock. So now that we've done our opening and swatching of our ink pads, these are the folders and stencils that I'm going to be using. I've bought these a while ago, but I hadn't had a chance to use them yet. I was kind of waiting for the perfect moment or for perfect inspiration. And once I got these limited edition ink pads in, it just seemed like it was perfect. So I'm using the framed poinsettia stencil and embossing folders. And then I'm also using the Cozy Christmas stencils and embossing folders as well. So I'm going to create 3 cards with the poinsettias and then 2 cards with the Cozy Christmas. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm using my Tacky Mat. I have a half a sheet of Hammermill Cardstock here, and I've placed my stencil at the top edge of that cardstock, and it actually fits just a little bit wider than that cardstock. These stencils are 6x6, not including the little strip on the left. That strip on the left is made for if you want to use this in the Tacky Mat, the Ultimate, which is a tool by Lisa Horton Crafts. I don't have that, so I'm just lining my stencils up with the top edge of my cardstock, and for me it works fine. I'm just using some ink blending tools to put down the matte blending ink. So this one is the Jingleberry, and you can see that it blends really quite easily. I'm trying to concentrate my color to be darker towards the inside of my poinsettias and lighter towards the edge of the petals. So anywhere I see a center to a poinsettia, I'm really concentrating that ink there and then blending out. Now, my blending brush doesn't really want to take these inks too well. You could tell when I just swipe them right on the cardstock that there is a good amount of ink in the pads, but my tools just didn't want, or this particular tool anyways, and my blue tool just really doesn't want to take ink. I don't know what I've done to them in the past, but I've had issues before. So I am going to keep building up the ink till I get my poinsettias a little bit darker. I did put this on a time lapse so that it wasn't taking forever. Once that was done, I totally messed up the rest of the filming for that particular background, but you're going to see it a couple times with these backgrounds. Now, this is my second background. What I'm going to use on this one is the Crimson Cheer, so that is the interference pad that is red on white cardstock and green on black cardstock. what I like to do with these ink pads is I like to play on both of those features. So I have a black distress ink pad here that I am focusing on the center of the flowers and then kind of blending my way out just so I don't have really harsh lines. Then I take a dry soft cloth and I rub away any of that excess ink from my stencil, and then I take a separate blending brush and use it with my interference pads. So on the black ink, you're going to be able to see more of the green interference, and on the white paper, you're going to be seeing more of the red dye. But when you tilt it into the light, you'll see some of that green interference shining in the light. So it creates a really beautiful background. This frame poinsettia stencil set has 3 different layers. So there's one layer that has the whole poinsettia petals. Then there's another layer that is just the flower centers. And then there's a third layer that is just kind of the veins of the petals. So for this one, this is just the background piece. And then I'm going in and I will be doing the middle layer. Now, even though these interference ink pads have both dye and pigment in them, the stencils wash off beautifully. I just rinse them under some water in the sink. I don't need any special cleaner in any way, shape, or form. They come off just with the water. So for the centers of my flowers, I want to use that festive fir, but even though I swatched them, in my head, I wasn't expecting them to be this bright Kelly green. Don't know what I was thinking because I knew it, but I think I was more expecting the color on the lid. And this is a little bit brighter. So even though I put that down first, it was too bright for what I was wanting. So I went and took my black distress pad, went over it with black ink, cleaned off all of the excess, and now I'm going back over it with that festive fir interference pad. So now what I'm going to be seeing on that black ink is more of the interference color, which is kind of a lighter green color. It's going to have a beautiful contrast with the poinsettia. You don't really see it on screen here, but it does look lovely. For my third stencil here, I am using the solid gold of the metallic pigment inks. I figured it would be a beautiful contrast with those petals to have that solid gold. Now, again, I'm concentrating the center of the flowers and then I'm blending my way out. So when I first dip my brush into my ink pad, I am starting at the center of the flower and blending my way out. You can add as much or as little ink as you want, but I do love it when there's some areas that have brighter ink and some that are kind of faded out a little bit. And usually where I like that brighter ink to be is the center of my petals. And this is going to go over top of those interference ink pads and create a beautiful detail on that poinsettia. So you can see it a little bit when I lift it and shine it in the light, but you're going to see it a lot more when I do my embossing. Now, what I didn't notice at this point was between washing and drying my stencils, I had flipped them over. So you can see right here, and I still didn't even notice it at this point, you can see how the design is different, and that's because I accidentally flipped it over. What that means is when I go to put it in my embossing folder, my second one here that I'm trimming right now is not going to fit in the embossing folder traditionally because of the fact that I had flipped my stencils. So what I'm going to end up having to do is do a reverse emboss. And you can see here when I'm putting it on my stencil, I start to get confused, wondering why in the world pretty much nothing is lining up. And it's because I had flipped it. Again, I still didn't even really realize what I had done. It took me a little while. And I left this in here so that I would make sure to talk about it. Here's where I realized what I did. And at this point, I wasn't sure if it was going to look okay being reverse embossed, but it ended up looking just fine. And to be honest, I think no one else would really notice. They might notice something was different until it was pointed out. So it is reverse embossed, so the details are different than the other cards, but there was no reason to waste this paper, or there was no reason to redo everything. So I completed the card as it was with the reverse embossing, and it creates just a different look to it. But again, unless it was pointed out to someone, I think you'd see that there was something different, but not really know what it was or really realize that it was not done intentionally. Now, when I do my embossing with my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine, I do it with a 3D embossing stacking. And for plain embossing folders, that works. It's not a lot of pressure, but it works enough to get that embossing. For this particular one here, because there's a die in here to cut out that center, it wasn't enough pressure. So I took a piece of Hammermill cardstock, folded it in half, and then put that below my embossing folder for that little bit of extra pressure. So anytime for the rest of the video that I'm going to be doing some embossing, I'll have that piece underneath there, and I'll be saving it for my Lisa Horton embossing folders to use with my machine. It's just an easy way to add that extra pressure, and by using cardstock, it has some give to it, so it's not so hard on your machine. So I matched up my second background with my embossing folder. And at this point, I thought I was only going to do 2 poinsettia cards. That's what I had in my mind. But as I was trimming these down and embossing them, more and more, I was curious what it was going to look like with the background done with the Yuletide sky with that beautiful blue. So I absolutely love how this background looks here. Now I typically do A2 cards or 5x7 cards. This embossing folder and stencil set are 6x6, and because of that circle in the center, there's no way to do an A2 card or even a 5x7 card with it. It just wouldn't, the proportions are not right. So I end up doing a 5.5 inch by 5.5 inch card. So my squares here, I'm cutting these down to 5 inches by 5 inches. I am cutting some of that poinsettia detail off. If you wanted, you could cut it bigger and create a bigger card. I didn't want it to be too big, and I wanted to make sure that I had the proper cardstock in order to do the card base with it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use some metallic papers for my backgrounds or my mats, as well as some black cardstock. So here, before I go too far with those other 2 backgrounds, I figured I might as well do the background that I started thinking about in my head. So I'm starting the same way as my second card. I'm using that black distress pad, concentrating that ink on the centers of my poinsettias, and then working my way out. And when I do my ink blending with stencils, I go both clockwise and counterclockwise, just to make sure I'm not having a buildup of ink towards one side of my stencil. By doing it both ways, I can make sure that I have a nice even coat of ink. Now I'm going in with that Yuletide sky, and for all of my interference pads, as well as those metallic pigment pads, I have a separate blending brush for each one of them. I use a label maker and put it right on the brush so I know exactly which brush is for what. You could, if you wanted, rinse your brushes out and dry them out for your next project. I'm not sure if it would work with the metallic pigment inks, but it does work for the interference ink pads. However, I prefer to have a brush for each one, and I just have them labeled. It's really up to you what you want to do. I absolutely love the look of this Yuletide sky as this background of these poinsettias. I always love foliage with non-traditional colors, so this is right up my alley. For the centers of those poinsettias, I'm going to do the same thing as I did for my second card. I'm putting my black ink down first, wiping off my stencil, and then I'm going to go in with that festive fir. So we're going to see more of that light green pigment here. Again, we're not going to see a whole lot on camera just because it really doesn't do these inks as much justice as they are in real life. For this one, for the veiny detail, I'm going to use the silver shine. I always love silver with blue, so I thought that would be absolutely gorgeous. And I also wanted to do something a little bit different from my first one. I wanted those details to be a bit of a different color. So I'm going to go in, concentrating that color towards the center of the petal and then working my way out. These ink pads are really nice and juicy, so they don't take a lot to do that ink blending. They come out they stencil quite quickly, and by using the Tacky Mat, it holds down my stencil for the most part. You can see that I am using my fingers to make sure that it doesn't shift, because there isn't a ton of area for that stencil. There's enough for it to grab, but I just don't want to accidentally have it shift while I'm doing my ink blending. Once I am done this, I can cut this piece down to the same size as the stencil, which would be 6x6 before embossing it, and then I will cut that down to 5 inches by 5 inches. Now I do clean off my Tacky Mat between each and every stenciling, and you can see that it does get stained, but it doesn't affect the use of it at all. I would much rather have a supply stained because it was used and loved than something in pristine condition because I wasn't wanting to use it to have it stained. So by cleaning it off in between or right after I've done the ink blending, I can reduce the staining as much as possible. So I'm going to put this piece in my embossing folder, tape it in place. I always like to tape these in place just to make sure or help them not shift or move on me while I'm doing my embossing. It's just a little bit of a safety net. Then I'm going to put it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine with that little cardstock shim in there for that extra pressure. It definitely helped that extra pressure to make that die work on the center and cut that piece out here. Now, when I'm doing my mats for these, I cut my mats at 5 1/4 by 5 1/4, and I have them completely visible in the center of that image. If you didn't want to see your mats in the center, you could take a circle die and you could cut your mats, cut that circle out of your mats just to have them a little bit more hidden. But I thought they complemented it really nicely. For my sentiment, I'm going to use the Season of Wonder sentiment stamp set. This is a new one from Spellbinders and Stampendous. Anytime I use a clear stamp set, I like to use a white eraser, erase the stamping surface of my stamp set to remove any manufacturing residue, and then I use a soft brush to remove any of the eraser bits. By doing this, I do it to the entire set. I know that if I've used one stamp from a set, I've done it to the entire set. I don't need to do that again. I'm positioning my stamp where that opening would be, and I want to stamp it and emboss it on this matte gold cardstock. This is from the Gold Treasured Cardstock pack from Spellbinders. They come in gold, silver, and rose gold, and they're absolutely gorgeous for holiday cards. They have 5 different finishes in them, so you can customize which gold or which silver or which rose gold you want with your card, and I've been using them a ton lately. I love the fact that I can pick and choose the finish that suits the project best, and there's 15 sheets in each package. You get 3 sheets of each finish. So for me, that's plenty to create my holiday cards with. So I used my embossing powder tool on the background before stamping with Versamark ink, and I did stamp it with my Misty stamping tool just to make sure that if I needed to stamp a second time, I'd be stamping in the exact same spot. Put my white embossing powder on and then use my embossing tool to heat that and melt that powder. With that melted, I can glue that to my card base. So my card base is 5 1/2 by 5 1/2 inches square. That mat is 5 1/4 by 5 1/4, and my poinsettia piece here is 5 inches by 5 inches. And for all of the poinsettia cards, those dimensions are exactly the same. So I didn't change up my mats or my card bases for any of them. Now, I don't do square cards often. I really love the look of them. I don't do them often because they require a different envelope. If you don't have an envelope that works for this, you can use like an envelope making tool in order to customize an envelope. I'm not doing envelopes for this video, but that's just an idea. For the centers of my poinsettias, I always like to make them a little bit sparkly just to catch the eye a little bit. So I'm using some Gliss and Stickles here. It is a transparent Stickles that has like a gold tone to it. So it's going to work perfectly with those inks. For my second card, I have a black mat. It's going to coordinate beautifully with the dark in the center of those poinsettias. And for my sentiment, I am going to stamp it with that solid gold metallic pigment pad. I do stamp it a couple times, and I use my stamp pressure tool just to make sure to get a clean impression of that stamp. I'm not embossing it, but you could easily emboss it with clear powder if you wanted to, or if you don't have this solid gold pad, you could use Versamark ink and then gold embossing powder. Another option. So while that ink is still wet on my stamp, I just used a damp cloth and cleaned it right off, making sure not to leave any ink residue on there, and it came off beautifully. Then I can glue everything to my card base here. Once again, I'm just using Barely Art glue in a fine tip bottle. I use this for most of my card assembly. I like having it in a fine tip bottle because then I can use it for even tiny delicate images or die cuts, and it works beautifully, but I can also use it for larger pieces. For this one, for the centers of those flowers, I use Platinum Stickles. They are more opaque. They are a gold that has a bit of a silver tone to them. I personally don't love yellow. It's one of my least favorite colors, so I don't like golds that have a really yellow tone to them. So this is my favorite gold tone of platinum because it works as a gold, but it's not too yellow. For my third card here, I'm using the Silver Treasured cardstock pack again, and I'm using the matte one as my mat around the poinsettias and in the center. I'm going to stamp my sentiment with black StazOn ink. This is a permanent ink, so it's going to work well on these specialty cardstocks. I only had to stamp it once and I got a perfectly clear impression, so there was no point in stamping it a second time. And because my ink was still damp on my stamp, just using a damp cloth to wipe it off took off all of that excess ink and I got a clean stamp again. Once again, for the assembling, I'm using that same Barely Art glue. I like to put a large acrylic block between my layers while I'm gluing things together. Just holds everything nice and flat, frees up my hands to work on other things. Here, I didn't actually do it because it was quick enough to add that second layer and add the glue to it before putting it down on my card, but then I will put that acrylic block on there. For this particular one, I'm using Twinkle Stickles for the centers of my poinsettias. This one is, once again, a transparent one, but it has a bluey purple tone to it, and I thought that would coordinate beautifully with the blue ink with the purple interference. So here are the finished poinsettia cards. My stickles isn't completely dry on them, but I'm setting them aside so that they can dry off screen while I work on my Cozy Christmas cards. So this stencil here, there's 9 layers to this stencil. So it's a little bit more involved than the last one. I'm once again using a half a sheet of Hammermill cardstock and putting everything on that tacky mat. I'm going to be doing each layer one at a time. This first layer here, I'm using Loganberry matte blending ink. For most of my area, or for most of my layers, I use that matte blending ink. I will use one of the metallics towards the end, and then I'm also using a different paste for the snow features. I'm just doing a solid layer of the matte blending inks. I'm not doing any shading with this at all, but you certainly could if you wanted to. Now these stencils are numbered, so it's really easy to tell which one is supposed to go next, and they're really easy to line up. I have the top and the left side lined up with the edges of my cardstock, and then when I put it down, if by chance I need to adjust it a little bit, I will do that. So this second color here is called Painted Eggshell. It's a really pale blue that has a bit of a gray tone to it. I'm trying to start with some of the lighter colors to start so I can build up the color on the back. I wasn't really expecting that Loganberry to be quite as dark as it was. It wasn't quite that dark when I swatched it when I first got it, but that's okay. I absolutely love the finished look of it. So I'm going to fill in all of the different areas, and just like my poinsettia background, you can see I'm working clockwise as well as counterclockwise. And once again, that's just so I don't have a buildup of ink towards one side of my stencil. Now we're on to stencil number 3. And for this one, I'm going to use the Arctic Frost, which is one of the new limited edition ones. It's the blue one. And it's a beautiful blue to go with that Painted Eggshell, to be a little bit darker than that. And again, I'm going both clockwise as well as counterclockwise. Some of the areas in these stencils are really quite tiny, so I make sure to do a thorough job with it so that I do get all of the detail from those stencils. And sometimes you can see I do go back to areas just to build that ink up just a little bit more. This, again, is one of the brushes that really doesn't want to take my inks. This one, I know at one point I had a really hard time with it and tried cleaning it out, and nothing I used to clean it would help it take ink any better. So really, it probably needs to be replaced, but I just don't want to replace an entire set. So for my next stencil here, I'm going to use that Merry Mistletoe color. This one is that green. Nice and bright. It's just a beautiful green to go with holiday cards. It's not really like a forest green, but it's also not quite as bright as the Festive Fir, which is that interference one. With that one done, I can go to the next one. This one has a lot of the windows in it, so I'm going to do Pina Colada. It's a really bright yellow. And once again, even though yellow is not my favorite color, there's sometimes when it's necessary. So for windows and stuff like that, where you want some nice bright color, this is perfect for this. Now, even though these have some pigment properties to them, you could see when I swatched the limited edition ones at the beginning, if I put it on a dark are a darker color or black, you're really not going to see a whole lot of that color. So any of these open areas that are on that loganberry, which is that pink color that I did to start with, you're going to see some of that yellow color, but you're really not going to see, it's not going to be stark and bright yellow like it is on that white cardstock. If you wanted to see it a little bit more, you could put a white pigment ink underneath it, let that completely dry, and then put that matte blending ink on there. I don't mind it the way it is, but if you want to see it more, that's an option. This dark color here was anthracite. It looks black on the front of the pad, but when I swatched it, it really has like a dark forest green tone to it. So I thought it would be beautiful for the wreaths and the garland. The last matte blending ink I'm using here is called Rhubarb Jam. It's a nice bright and also a little bit dark pink. Works perfectly with that loganberry that I used for the first stencil. And all of these inks, when I go to wash them off, they rinse off that stencil really, really easily. So you don't have to need, or you don't need anything special to clean them off. So I'm reversing the last two stencils. So this one is technically supposed to be the last one. And I'm doing this with that solid gold ink pad. This has the details inside of the window, so I thought it would be beautiful on top of that pina colada. And I love adding that little bit of gold to it. For my last stencil, this is all the snowy areas. So what I'm going to do for this one is I'm going to use some moon dust glitter gel from Stencils or from Ranger and put that in these areas and then let them dry. Now this is transparent, so it's going to work perfectly and look like snow on the white areas. On the colored areas, it's just going to put a layer of glitter on those areas. So there's some layers that don't go on a white background. You're going to see that glitter, but it's going to be the color that's underneath it because it is transparent. Now, all of these inks are water reactive, so you'll see when my piece is done, any of the areas that this stickles touched, it's going to start to blend and bleed. And one of those areas is that roof bit. It's just what it does. There's not really a way to prevent it. So with those stickles down, I let them completely dry, and I actually let them dry overnight before using the matching dies to cut them out. Now, just like putting my pieces in my embossing folder to emboss, when I die cut my pieces, I like to put some tape on the die just to make sure that it's not going to move and shift. I was going to cut both at the same time, and then I realized the bottoms of those dies overlap, so they need to be cut separately. So I taped my die in place with some Best Ever Craft tape, then run it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine to die cut it out. And then I will do the second one off screen. And once those are die cut, I can match them up with the embossing folder and emboss all of those details in there. I like to do the embossing part after the die cutting part, just to make sure that none of those embossed details get flattened when they are die cut. So they are all die cut now, and I can emboss both of those pieces at the same time. I'm using some pieces of that Best Ever Craft tape to tape it in place. And these are pieces that are reused from the die cutting, so you don't need new pieces each and every time. I reuse my pieces many, many, many times till it stops sticking, just to get the most use out of it. So once both of these pieces are taped in place, we can close that folder, use the embossing stacking, and once again I'm using that extra shim made with that piece of Hammermill cardstock folded in half, and then just pressing those details in. Now originally when I started this video, I had in my mind that I was only going to be doing one card with these cozy Christmas homes, but I figured I had them done, I might as well do a second card, and the two cards are going to be very, very similar to each other with just some slight differences. Now, you could put both of those houses on the same background too if you wanted. I didn't want to because there's two. I like to have kind of odd numbers, so 1 or 3, and I didn't really want 2, and I didn't want to make more houses. So I am going to do 2 different cards here, each one having one of the houses. For the background, I'm using the Decorative Pearls embossing folder. This is just a beautiful one. It's a nice generic background, but I thought it looked kind of pretty and it would be nice almost as like kind of blowing snow. Not really, but almost. So I emboss those, put them to the side. For my cards here, I'm going to do some A2 cards. So I have some mats here that are cut down to 4 inches by 5 1/4. I am using the Merry Mistletoe, which is the green, and the Arctic Frost, which is the blue matte blending pad, to put some ink around them for that mat to make sure that it matches beautifully. I'm then taking my pieces that were embossed with that Decorative Pearls embossing folder, and I'm cutting those down to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. One of them I'm going to leave as is. The second one, I'm going to take that solid gold metallic ink pad. I'm just going to lightly brush it over top of that embossed background. So that embossing is just going to catch that ink, and it absolutely looks beautiful. It's not too stark that it looks out of place. It's going to be subtle enough for that background still. So I'm gluing my mat here onto one of my card bases, putting my acrylic block on there to hold that nice and flat, and then adding some glue to one of my embossed backgrounds here. Now, when you're gluing down an embossed background, make sure you put some glue on the pieces that are going to have contact with your card base, just to make sure that it glues down well. Now I can glue down my house, and I'm going to do the same thing as I did with that embossing, or with that Decorative Pearls embossed background. Make sure there's some glue on the pieces that are going to have contact with that embossed background especially. And by having that acrylic block on there, I can make sure that everything is nice and flat and that those pieces have contact with them. I'm going to glue down my second card, same as my first one. The design itself is very, very simple, with just a mat, the embossed piece, and then my focal image on top. But when you have focal images like these houses that have so much detail to them, you really don't need a really complicated design behind them. Now for these two cards, I didn't add any sentiments, but you could certainly stamp a sentiment in the center of the card. I figured I would leave them blank and stamp them later when I went to use them, and just find something most appropriate for what they're being used for. Now these are kind of wintry Christmas cards with these houses, but you could certainly change it up a little bit and just put a generic sentiment on there. It doesn't need to be anything specifically winter or Christmas. Now, to add a little bit of extra texture, as if there wasn't enough, I'm using some glossy accents and putting them in the window areas. So I'm not putting them in the different window panes. I'm putting them just all in the center of the windows, and it's just going to give some shine and a little bit of a different texture to part of that card. Now, the one thing that at one point I thought I had messed up was that bottom window with the tree in it. Because these ink pads are water reactive, as I was putting that glossy accent in there, I suddenly started worrying that I had ruined the card, because those inks were going to completely blend in together. The lines did become a little bit more fuzzy, but they didn't totally blend together. You could still distinctly see a tree, so it's not ruined in any way. And I love the final look with those glossy accents in those windows. Now, there's the two finished cards with that Cozy Christmas, and now we have our finished poinsettias. I absolutely love the look of all of these different limited edition inks. Who knows how long they're going to be available? I'm filming this video when I first received mine, and they are already sold out, the first batch. So I will be posting this when they become available again. And if you're wanting some inks, don't wait too long, because they haven't been lasting long. Thank you so much for joining me today and spending your time with me. I really appreciate all the time that you do spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.